The James Bond franchise entering the 90s needed something that would bring in new, younger audiences, essentially someone who could de-age the franchise. And there was one man for the job: Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan was the fifth actor to play Ian Fleming's James Bond 007 in the Eon-produced James Bond franchise. He didn't just bring a fresh face to the series, he also brought with him an entirely new generation of fans that appealed to a much younger audience. The franchise had been growing a little bit old through the 80s and went on a pretty long hiatus, having its longest break between films, which was 6 years at the time. You could say the franchise was in crucial need of new life. My name is Dylan McKay, and I'm going to be taking you through a journey of how Pierce Brosnan became James Bond and how he essentially de-aged the James Bond franchise. First, I need to take you back. The year is 1981, and Roger Moore is in the midst of filming his fifth James Bond outing, For Your Eyes Only. A co-star of his in the film was Cassandra Harris, who happened to be married to a young Pierce Brosnan. So when Cassandra Harris was filming her scenes for the film, Pierce Brosnan occasionally visited set and had a bit of a friendship with producer Albert R. Broccoli. Albert R. Broccoli going so far as to say, if he can act, he's my next guy. So, Broccoli was a huge fan of Pierce Brosnan and genuinely wanted him to be the next Bond when Roger Moore would retire. At this stage in Roger Moore's career, he was on a film-by-film contract, so after each film it was kind of up in the air as to whether or not he would continue. And at the time of For Your Eyes Only, he was already 53 years old, and it was kind of feeling like he was nearing the end of his tenure. However, Roger Moore wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He made two more James Bond films, 1983's Octopussy and 1985's A View to a Kill, which was a box office smash and had a #1 Billboard single, Dance into the Fire by Duran Duran. Side note, David Bowie was actually originally cast to be in A View to a Kill, which I learned from the research on this video, so that's crazy, but ultimately he backed out and Christopher Walken replaced him, stating that he didn't want to just stand on the sideline and watch his double do a bunch of stunts for 6 months. But that would have been so cool. Anyway, that has absolutely nothing to do with our story. Roger Moore's films had still been massively successful throughout the 80s, even though they were receiving a little bit more of a critical response from both fans and critics alike, specifically targeting Roger Moore's age. It really had become apparent, especially in Octopussy and then View to a Kill taking it even further, just how old Roger Moore was becoming in the role, and it started to feel especially awkward when all of his female co-stars were around half of his age, and Roger recalled being mortified when he figured out he was actually older than Tanya Roberts' mom in A View to a Kill. That's a whole other topic and issue that's always been a problem in Hollywood. You know, maybe the love interest should be within a similar age range as our lead character, but thus was the 80s and the James Bond franchise, and this is what we got. A very old James Bond with very young female co-stars. So, to Roger's credit, he was an actor doing the job, and he even talked about this later in his career and said he was about 400 years too old for the part. As Roger aged, so did his Bond films. They started to tread a familiar formula and became a bit old-fashioned. They really needed someone who could appeal to a younger audience and kind of reinvigorate fresh life into the James Bond series. We even had Sean Connery at this time making public statements about how he felt James Bond should be somewhere between 33 and 35 years old. I'd like to point out again that I do love this era of Roger Moore films. I'm a big fan of For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, and A View to a Kill. And one day, I promise you, I will make a video about it. Okay, focus, Dylan. 6 months after completing A View to a Kill, it's December of 1985, and Roger Moore, at the age of 58, announces his retirement from the role of James Bond. The producers found themselves in a familiar position. They needed their next Bond. And as Roger Moore had proved, the Bond franchise could continue on with a different lead actor in the role. So writers immediately began working on the next James Bond film script, knowing that Roger Moore had hung up his tuxedo. The year is now 1986, Roger officially retired, work on the next Bond already underway, and producers knew exactly who they wanted to play James Bond. He was 33 years old. which is what Sean Connery recommended. The young lad that had visited set a mere 5 years ago had not been forgotten, and Albert R. Broccoli still wanted him as his James Bond 007, Pierce Brosnan. In the time since he'd met Pierce Brosnan, he had become popular on a TV series called Remington Steele, which had ran for 4 seasons and had just recently been canceled by NBC, and done a myriad of other TV and smaller film work. But his career was about to change in a massive way as he signed on to be the next James Bond 007 in 1986. Pierce Brosnan immediately began doing promo work, doing all the photo shoots, posing with the gun, and getting ready to be James Bond. His celebrity status immediately skyrocketed, and the fan reception was very excited because people remembered him from Remington Steele, which was a very similar tuxedo-adorned character, so he seemed like a very natural successor in the role. Well, there was one major wrinkle to this scenario. NBC, which had just canceled Remington Steele, realized their star was going to be the next James Bond, and that interest in Remington Steele was going up. Their contract with Pierce Brosnan had a 60-day option in which they could still renew Remington Steele for a season 5, and he would be obligated to return. Now, producers of the Bond franchise reassured Pierce Brosnan that negotiations would take place and that they would take care of this. So, as I mentioned before, Pierce Brosnan continued on with his promo work and was toasting with a bottle of Cristal with his late wife, Cassandra Harris, to a new life that was about to begin. And just 3 days before the 60-day option expired, he received a call from his agent. Just as quickly as Brosnan's dreams were becoming a reality, they were shattered in an instant. 3 days prior to NBC's contract expiring with Pierce Brosnan, they decided to renew Remington Steele, acting on their option, and Albert R. Broccoli not wanting to wait around or have his Bond character associated with a popular contemporary TV series, he withdrew his offer from Brosnan to play James Bond. Ironically, this led to a drop-off in numbers for Remington Steele, and the show didn't last another 5 months before getting canceled again. Broccoli worked quick, and Bond had already found its next leading man, leaving Pierce Brosnan behind in the rearview mirror. Now, there is limited information online on how the public reacted to Pierce Brosnan not being James Bond anymore, and Pierce Brosnan himself has been really quiet about his feelings towards it, outside of expressing that he did feel extreme, crippling disappointment. Because how could you not? Well, certain promos, including Diet Coke commercials, still aired, having Bond-like charm and persona.
Ours, as you know, is not a perfect world. May I? That's why it's so refreshing when something really perfect comes along. Like Diet Coke.
It did still help Pierce Brosnan's celebrity status, and he did get a few other roles in TV shows, and some bigger budget films like Mrs. Doubtfire and the big budget miniseries Noble House. But unfortunately, his opportunity at playing James Bond was a matter of wrong time, wrong place.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond.
It was announced on August 7th, 1986, Timothy Dalton, 41 years old, the next official James Bond 007. His announcement was met with some surprise, but very quickly the producers made him the next face of James Bond, and Sean Connery provided his stamp of approval for him. There are stories of Dalton being considered to play James Bond back in 1971, as well as right after Roger Moore retired. He is a name that had been in the mix for a while with different producers in the Bond franchise, but there are also stories that Timothy Dalton was hesitant to accept the role, and Albert R. Broccoli didn't like his hesitancy, so Broccoli, being a little bit stubborn, had to be pushed to reignite that offer. But as he was selling the movie, he did say Timothy Dalton was his Bond, and he would choose Dalton to play Bond even if Brosnan became available. So, there are contradicting reports there, but either way, Timothy Dalton was the next guy. As for Dalton's hesitancy, he was an actor of the craft. He wanted to make sure if he signed on for the role that they were going to be good films. And something Timothy Dalton has cited is he felt the Ian Fleming James Bond character from the books had never really been represented on film before, and he really wanted to make a concerted effort to bring that character from book to screen to life. And you gotta give him credit, I think he did a good job of doing that. With this being the direction Dalton wanted to go with the series, Michael G. Wilson, who was a writer on the series, also wanted to take the franchise in a different direction to something a little bit more serious, with more grounded plot elements and a little less campy than the Roger Moore films had turned. So there was a huge interest in steering the Bond franchise back to something that would feel a little bit more realistic. Thus became the greatest criticism of Dalton's era, a set of films stuck between two different ideas. A Bond that takes himself more seriously, and a more realistic set of plot elements and villain motivations, but still some of that campiness and exaggeration that the Bond franchise was known for. Critics were again mixed, as they often are with the James Bond series, but most notably Roger Ebert's review of The Living Daylights was a 2 out of 4 stars, stating, "Without a great Bond villain, Bond girl, or a hero with a sense of humor, this belongs on the lower rungs of the Bond ladder." Humor, quippiness, and wild plot elements were all staples of the Bond franchise at this point, and they were mostly not represented here in favor of more grounded elements. Its follow-up, License to Kill, which came out in 1989, course corrected a little bit, but also brought with it a much darker and more violent James Bond. In fact, this is the first James Bond series in the US to be rated PG-13, and the only Bond film to be rated a 15 BBFC, all for its depiction of violence. License to Kill fared worse in US theaters, only making $34.6 million between US and Canada, which meant it was the worst James Bond film in the box office in the United States when accounting for inflation. However, the critics actually applauded the harder edge of the film, and for comparison's sake, Roger Ebert gave this film a 3.5 out of 4 stars, which is much higher praise than the previous entry. Dalton's performance as Bond in retrospect feels pretty revolutionary, and the reappraisal of these films through the years has been very positive to say the least. But the films at the time didn't seem to have the same resonance. Maybe audiences and Bond fans weren't ready for the seriousness of Dalton's Bond. It's hard to say. Dalton has now made 2 James Bond films, and before he can get to a 3rd Bond film, a combination of factors arise that caused serious delays in production. Most notably, a huge legal battle, as well as the introduction of producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, who are the kids of Albert R. Broccoli, whose health was starting to decline. And after years of delays, Dalton actually resigned from the role of James Bond. Producers did want him to stay on and make anywhere between 4 and 5 more movies. Timothy Dalton would have considered a 3rd and final film because he did feel he had something still to say with the character, but he didn't want to commit to that many more films, and thus, because his contract was in a place where he could resign from the role, he did so. A saga of films that could have been but never were. Movies that didn't translate with the audiences at the time. You could really say, for Dalton's era, wrong time, wrong place.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
1995, 007, GoldenEye. Directed by Martin Campbell, and the first Bond film produced by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. And the first official appearance of my first James Bond, Pierce Brosnan. He's back, baby! He's now 41 years old, and it's been 6 years since our last James Bond film, License to Kill. As I mentioned before, was the previous longest span between films. We've since had that again. Brosnan's story had come full circle. On June 7th of 1994, Pierce Brosnan was officially announced again as James Bond 007. He was hesitant, he needed to be reassured that it was gonna be for real this time, but it was, and it was to much fanfare and applause, because fans really wanted him to play James Bond. They were excited about him for years. And now it's time to begin work on his first Bond film, GoldenEye. Well, in the 6 years that had passed since License to Kill, world politics had changed pretty dramatically. This became the first James Bond film produced after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a lot of doubt over the relevance of the character in today's modern world. Many felt that the character was best left as an icon of the past. And producers even discussed at this time setting a period piece in the 60s, or even doing a female 007 to kind of get around reinventing the character. But ultimately, to better judgment for the time, they decided to double down on what made James Bond James Bond. Guns, gadgets, girls, explosions, this was gonna be big. And they leaned into this in the marketing. This was gonna be a huge film. Bond was going to explode back onto the scene in a big way in the 90s. GoldenEye, it was revolutionary, and a big part of that is to Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson's forward-thinking ideas to reinvent Bond for the 90s, with the introduction of Dame Judi Dench playing the first female M, and she brought a huge new level of gravitas. An incredible supporting cast, with Sean Bean playing the villain and Famke Janssen as the wild Xenia Onatopp, Isabella Scorupco, and a crazy cast of supporting characters like Alan Cumming and Robbie Coltrane and even Minnie Driver. This movie had a lot of star power, and GoldenEye raked in the biggest box office since Moonraker. And for the first time in a long time for the Bond franchise, it received mostly positive reviews from critics and fans alike, with reviews saying GoldenEye brings the series into a modern context, and the result is a 007 entry that's high-tech, action-packed, and urbane. Pierce Brosnan was reviewed as a decided improvement over his predecessor, with flair for wit to go along with his natural charm. The film breathed fresh creative and commercial life into the series, and fans loved Brosnan in the role. He was maybe the most handsome and suave Bond. He also brought the brute force and charm of Connery, humor and vulnerability of Roger Moore's Bond. He was a proper Bond in every way. And the success of GoldenEye set a whole new wave of 90s and early 2000s spy films, reinvigorating interest in James Bond and spy films altogether. Pierce Brosnan's interpretation of Bond didn't just carry it over the hump into the 90s, kind of rebooted interest in the series. It was fresh again. And you cannot mention GoldenEye the film without mentioning GoldenEye the video game on the Nintendo 64. Released a few years later in 1997, this is a groundbreaking video game, and I'm sure many of you watching this are familiar with it, but not only was this game massively successful, it was one of the first of its kind. It became a blueprint for first-person shooter games, which has inspired so many video games that come all the way to today, like Call of Duty, and the way that game plays is inspired by GoldenEye. It really was a massive step forward in video gaming. And many kids my age remember playing this on 11-inch screens with 4 players doing split screen in your little box and calling each other screen peekers. I even found this movie called The Golden Era, which was at a local record shop that I go to, and I hadn't seen it yet, and I gotta check it out, but there's a whole film made about the impact of this video game itself. And when you look up GoldenEye, you have to specify if you're talking about the film or the video game, because they're both so iconic. I think that's a huge part of what brought in this younger audience to the films. Also in 1997, we got Pierce Brosnan's second Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies, and soon after, in 1999, The World Is Not Enough. Both of those movies also had video game tie-ins. The video game aspect of Pierce Brosnan's career continued on through the early 2000s, to the point in 2002 where they created a full, original, unique story for Nightfire, and then in 2004 went so far as to have him do his own voice acting and cast Willem Dafoe, Heidi Klum, John Cleese, to name a few. A totally original James Bond story, which for people like me, when you recall Pierce Brosnan's era as James Bond, you almost can't not talk about his video games. Brosnan effectively was the face of the best action movies coming out in the 90s and the best video games coming out. So as a kid, when you'd go to the video store and you'd rent a James Bond movie with him in it, and then you could also go home and play as him in the video games with your friends, I think it really helped shape a new culture of Bond fans that were kids. And honestly, if Brosnan's movies weren't enough to make you a Bond fan, his video games covered the rest of the market, because I knew plenty of people that played the video games and never even watched the movies, which is kind of crazy to me in retrospect, but those games were huge. Video games at the time and tech was moving forward at a groundbreaking pace that really aligned perfectly with Brosnan's era of films. The turnaround time to produce these video games was a lot quicker, and the advancements were much bigger. And this didn't continue on for the Bond franchise past Brosnan. Daniel Craig's video game tie-ins are absolute garbage. They even remade GoldenEye like 3 different times, and none of it's good. Maybe some of it's okay, but outside of that, the icon of Bond was so prevalent in my childhood because I also remember books like this and other books I got at my school book fairs like this. There was so much interest in spy films again that was curated from, I think, kids' obsession with these video games, which kind of came from James Bond, and then spawned all of these movies like Spy Kids and The Tuxedo and Agent Cody Banks, and Bond was hitting like a peak of popularity again that it made perfect sense for Mike Myers to do his Austin Powers movies at this time. And a lot of this movement and wave feels reminiscent of the Bond mania that happened in the 1960s with Sean Connery's Bond films, because he also inspired a huge slew of other espionage films and spy films that tried to interpret their own version of Bond. In a way, Pierce Brosnan's films did that, but with more of a younger audience in mind. But anyway, back to Pierce Brosnan's films themselves. Now, I am a huge fan of them personally, but being objective here, GoldenEye is the only one that received mostly positive reviews. Tomorrow Never Dies and The World's Not Enough fared pretty well, but were mixed critically. And in 2002, my first Bond film that I got to go see in movie theaters, Die Another Day, was considered a pretty big disaster, I think. Die Another Day was critically panned and considered one of the worst James Bond films ever by a lot of people. But hey, time heals all. It's not typically ranking at the bottom of people's lists like it kinda used to be when that movie came out. The Brosnan Bond films got the most bombastic, the most sexy, the most exaggerated out of any Bond film era that had existed prior, and Die Another Day was the absolute peak of this. However, the landscape of action films really changed post-2001. Things were taking a turn towards more grounded, gritty, and realistic, looking at you, Jason Bourne, and audiences didn't seem to be as ecstatic about the over-the-top nature of James Bond anymore. Bond needed to evolve again. And maybe now Dalton's Bond would have fared a little bit better, but the Brosnan era was already at an end. After an explosive 4-film, 8-year run, Pierce Brosnan had officially become an icon in the history books as one of the greatest to ever play James Bond 007.
Bond. James Bond.
Bond. James Bond.
If it weren't for the hiatus and legal battles, Dalton very well may have had more Bond films. And if it weren't for Brosnan's Remington Steele contract, Brosnan could have been Bond 9 years earlier. There's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts, but Brosnan was my James Bond growing up, and the reason I am the massive James Bond fan that I am today. So, I am a little bit biased towards his interpretation of the character and his run of films and video games. And yes, I was one of those 007 fans that was first introduced via the GoldenEye video game before I'd even seen any of the movies. I remember a friend of mine asking, "Have you ever played GoldenEye?" And I was like, "What's that?" He's like, "You don't know GoldenEye?" No. And we rented the video game and we played the video game with my brother and neighborhood friends. And that got me so interested in 007 that in one of my weekly trips to Blockbuster with my dad, who was a huge movie fanatic and would always let me pick out a VHS to rent, I decided to rent GoldenEye the movie. And it changed my life. I loved it so much, and I went back and rented Tomorrow Never Dies, The World's Not Enough, and then I just started working my way back through the entire run of James Bond films. I remember my dad being surprised that the 8 or 9-year-old me at the time was actually a fan of Sean Connery's and Roger Moore's Bond movies, and it kind of re-sparked a little bit of my dad's interest because he had grown up watching Roger Moore, and so he watched a lot of those with me as I would rent them. But man, I just remember going to the video stores and seeing all the iconic Bond VHS covers on the shelves and just picking out whatever one I thought had the coolest cover art. Oh, this one has ninjas in it. That's freaking cool. And then I would rent that one. And when I was out of Bond films, I started renting random other Pierce Brosnan action movies like Detonator and Detonator 2, which I think I have on DVD somewhere. I should rewatch those movies. Anyway, I loved all of the Bond movies, and I loved video rental stores. But bringing it back to our central thesis here, Pierce Brosnan's representation of James Bond de-aged the Bond franchise. A franchise that was starting to become a little bit tired, a little bit old-fashioned, and on the brink of not really resonating with fans. When the 90s hit, he brought with it the biggest, most bombastic super spy that ever was. And his films did it in a way that really transcended to an entirely new audience. You could watch GoldenEye, World's Not Enough, Tomorrow Never Dies, and they felt very different than the James Bond films that came prior. They really were like the modern, sleek, high-tech 90s new millennium age of Bond. And because of the tie-ins with the video games, this brought Bond to a very young audience. It de-aged the character without rebooting it and making the back catalog still a present and ultimately the best sequel franchise series of all time. But if the Bond franchise needed changing in 2002, then I personally would have loved to see a change that would have involved Brosnan in the role still. If it meant taking it to a more serious or grounded place, I think he would have done a great job at that, but that wasn't his place. That was for Daniel Craig and for Casino Royale and what we got down the road, which is an entirely different set of Bond films. Brosnan's era is kind of the last of the Bond films as we know it. This kind of serialized, one-shot story films that didn't necessarily need to be tied together, telling a character arc like Daniel Craig's films do down the line. This was the last and the biggest of the just fun, throw everything at the screen type of Bond that the James Bond films were known for. And I really feel like that 90s, early 2000s high-tech super era boom was perfect for the Pierce Brosnan series. It was a small window of time, but we maximized it. Like, it was only 8 years, but it was a beautiful, beautiful time in history for me. But I will say, a Pierce Brosnan return to the character of James Bond years down the line, that's still something I want to see. So, Amazon, if you want to make a one-off Bond film with Pierce Brosnan in the role, please. The fans want to see it, or at least this one does. Anyway, I had a lot of fun making this video. Thank you to the extremely positive response that I had to my Roger Moore Save James Bond video, which if you haven't watched, you should click this link that'll show up here at the end of this and go watch it. There were so many insightful comments that you guys left on that video that were so fascinating for me to read, like many firsthand stories from people specifically who had grown up watching the Roger Moore movies. It was really cool. So thank you for that response, and let me know what you guys think below on this Pierce Brosnan one. I am a smaller YouTuber, so thank you guys so much for clicking on this, and liking and subscribing means a ton to me. All your comments, I try to read them all, so thank you so much for leaving them. Yeah, James Bond forever.